What's up, YouTube? This is the 82 and 0 podcast. Today we're going to take a look at Michael Jordan. So, Jordan was born February 17th, 1963. He was the son of Dolores and James Jordan. But in 1968, however, they moved to North Carolina. And in his high school career, he was more into baseball than basketball. In fact, in his sophomore year, he only stood at 5'11", and he was deemed too short to play at that level. However, after a growth spurt and after being cut from his team, he improved his work ethic relentlessly, coming back to score multiple 40-point games in his high school career. This resulted in him being heavily scouted by different colleges. Duke wanted him, North Carolina wanted him, South Carolina, Syracuse. He ultimately chose North Carolina because it was closest to home. And in North Carolina, he actually won the 1982 championship game against Georgetown, which was a future NBA rival, Patrick Ewing. He had the game-winning shot. He had one of the greatest collegiate careers before entering for the 1984 draft. And the 84 draft was, most people either say the 2003 or the 84 draft was the greatest draft of all time. There was multiple Hall of Famers in the 84 draft. You had Charles Barkley, John Stockton, Michael Jordan. So he was chosen third. And I know this sounds crazy today. People are saying, how could they not take him? You got to understand that at the time, they built teams around centers. They didn't think to build a team around a guard. So in that 84 draft, the Houston Rockets selected Hakeem Olajuwon, forming their big two of Ralph Sampson, Hakeem Olajuwon. But Portland selected Sam Bowie. So if you think about it, Portland could have potentially had Clyde Drexler and Michael Jordan. Who knows how many championships they would have had. But it was the Chicago Bulls that selected Michael Jordan with the third pick. Now, his first year, he put up amazing numbers, MVP caliber numbers. He averaged 28 points, 6 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals, and he averaged 50% from the line. This is before, however, he developed a mid-range game. And if you look at a lot of those older games, he was more like a slasher, drive to the basket kind of guy. And this Bulls team was trash. They did make the playoffs, however. They lost in 4 games to the Milwaukee Bucks with Sidney Moncrief. I'd say their best player other than Jordan was Orlando Woldridge. It was just not a good team. However, in the 86 season, Jordan had broke his foot early on in the season. And he came back late in the season. However, they wanted him on a minutes restriction, and this pissed Jordan off because the team didn't want to risk him injuring himself again. But also, Jordan, being the killer he is, he didn't want to miss on a playoff spot. He didn't like the idea that the Bulls were okay missing the playoffs so they could get a higher draft pick. He wanted to be in the playoffs. So, the first round, they matched up against the 86 Boston Celtics. And this is arguably the greatest Celtics team of all time. You had Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish. That was a 67-win team. The 86 Bulls team, though, however, was a 30-win team. So they were just way above their league, man. They had no chance of winning that. However, nobody told Jordan that. Game 1, he scored 49 points. Ultimately, though, they lost 123 to 104. Game 2, however, was one for the ages. Jordan scored 63 points, which is a playoff record. Most points ever scored by a player in the playoffs against the 86 Celtics. This, after the game, Larry Bird described Jordan as God described as a human being. They lost 135 to 131 though. And then game 3, they lost 122 to 104. And this would start the trend of the Bulls losing early on before he could get his supporting cast. 87, the Bulls went 40 and 42, losing in the first round again to Boston. However, Jordan, he was putting up good numbers. In 87, he had 37 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals, and a block a game on elite shooting. 88 season, some people describe this as Jordan's absolute best. He did improve their record to 50 games, and they did make it to the conference semifinals, where they lost to the Pistons in 5, and this would start their future rivalry with the Pistons. But this is where Jordan, in 88, he won the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year, averaging 35 points per game. This is the most a player has ever scored, or average scoring, while getting Defensive Player of the Year. He averaged 3.2 steals and 1.6 blocks as a guard. This is when the team started to get a little more depth around him. Scottie, he was young. He had 7 points per game. He wasn't the star yet. He had Charles Oakley, which they ended up trading Charles Oakley, which pissed Jordan off. But they had Horace Grant. Then you get to the 89 season. The Bulls, they had a 47 and 35 record. But they made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals against the Pistons. And you got to understand the Pistons-Bulls rivalry during this time. The Pistons fought very dirty. They enacted what were the Jordan rules because they knew during this time Jordan was going to want to take all the shots. And Jordan would drive to the basket. So their plan was to knock him on his ass every time he came to the basket. They'd throw cheap elbows, cheap fouls. Very physical game. All right. Much different than today. Very physical. So the media pretty much attacked Jordan during this time. They said, yeah, he's a good player, puts up good scoring numbers, but he's never going to be a champion. They said, how is he going to be a champion when he scores all this point? Because the narrative at the time was, if you're a guard, you should be facilitating the offense. Their coach at the time was Doug Collins, which they got rid of in favor of Phil Jackson. And this worked great because Phil Jackson convinced Jordan in the next season, the 89-90 season, to kind of trust his teammates better. So they ran what was called the triangle offense, which got more people involved. And you saw Jordan's numbers start to go down. He wasn't putting up like 37, 35, but he was still putting up good numbers. Like he averaged 33 points per game that year. And this is when Scottie took his leap and Horace Grant took his leap. Scottie was putting up about 16 points a game. Horace was putting up about 13 and 8 rebounds. So the team started to step up. They make it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, right? They lose in 7 games to the Pistons. And this is one of the lowest points, I think, of that early Bulls team. Because they were just obliterated, 93-74. Everybody had a terrible game on the Bulls other than Jordan. Jordan actually was the leading scorer with 31 points. Scottie pretty much missed all of his shots. He had terrible migraines that whole game. And the Pistons would go on to win their championship. That's 2 in a row at the Bulls' expense. But, however, they came back the 91 season, and this is when the Bulls made their name. This is when the league started to transition. As Bird was getting older, dealing with injuries, Magic was the MVP in 90, and he was still on top of his game, but we didn't know about his diagnosis that was yet to come. So it was really Jordan taking over the older players. So the 91 Bulls, they went 61-21. They beat the Pistons in 4-0. They swept them. There wasn't any Pistons wins in that series. And we all know the bad sportsmanship that the Pistons had. They didn't shake their hands when the Bulls won. They just walked off the court. But this was the end of that Pistons dynasty. Jordan broke that. He goes to the finals where he's matched up against with Magic and the Lakers. They beat the Lakers in 5 games. The Lakers took game 1, and although the Bulls had a better record at the time, many people thought the Lakers would win given Magic's experience in the finals. But Magic got obliterated by the Bulls. Now, the following year, 92, this is arguably one of the greatest Bulls team. Some people will say 96, some people will say 92. The 92 Bulls went 67-15. They defeated the Portland Trail Blazers 4-2 in the finals. And in that game 1, Michael responded because during the time, a lot of the criticism on Jordan was, well, Clyde Drexler can do everything Jordan can do, including shoot the 3. But Jordan came out and he set a record for the time, 6 3-pointers and a half. And that's where he gave his famous shrug. They beat the Portland Trail Blazers, winning their 2nd title. And in the offseason, this is when the NBA started allowing, or when the Olympics started allowing NBA players back in to compete. So they built what became the Dream Team. This was the result of their terrible loss in 88. They wanted to come back and show the world that America could win it all. So Magic Johnson, who had recently been diagnosed with HIV, was cleared to play in the Olympics. Bird was on the Olympic team. Barkley was on the team. David Robinson was on the team. Chris Mullin was on the team. It was a deep team. Probably the greatest assembled Olympic team in history. Some people will say 08, some people will say 92. But they went undefeated. And they blew out every team they played. There would be times where they'd win by 30 points. But after that, coming back to the 92-93 season, was when he started to reach scandals for his gambling problem. Jordan was heavily criticized by the media for his gambling. And in fact, in the 93 finals, they made it back having a 57-25 record. They were matched up against the Phoenix Suns. Now, this time, the Bulls weren't the favorites. The Suns, this was their greatest team at that point. They won 62-20 games. They had the MVP of the league in Charles Barkley, who they recently acquired through a trade. They had Kevin Johnson, Danny Ainge, Tom Chambers, Dan Marley, Cedric Ceballos. It was a deep team. So many people, including Charles, he thought he was the greatest player in the world at this time. Going into that finals, however, the Bulls would ultimately win in 6. They took game 1, 100-92. Game 2, they took 111-108. Now, game 3, the Phoenix Suns took 129-121, and this was a 3 overtime game. The Suns were convinced that they were going to be able to stay in this. So game 4, Bulls won it back, 111-105. Game 5, the Suns won 108-98. Now going into game 6, they're back in Chicago. And the Bulls' plan was to win in Chicago and end it because they didn't want to risk going back to Phoenix where the Suns had the home court advantage. They wanted to end it now. They won 99-98 off of a game-winning shot. However, in the offseason, Jordan's father passed away. He was murdered. And there's a lot of speculations, and I won't get into the conspiracy theories. There's theories that the mafia killed his father. There's all kinds of things. I'm just going to stay away from that. So Jordan would retire. And at this time, he had 3 championships. He had an MVP in 88, 91, 92. So he was a 3-time champion, 3-time MVP. This is his first retirement. Now the Bulls, they would still be good. the next year they won 55 games. A lot of that is due to Phil Jackson's coaching and Pippen taking over the role. However, they lost in 7 games to the Knicks. Now, during this time, Jordan was playing baseball for the minor leagues. Nobody really expected him to come back. But in the 95 season, the 94-95 season, the Bulls, they didn't have that good of a record. They ended up finishing 47-35, but Jordan returned with only 17 games left in the season. And he was rusty. He had some very poor shooting nights those first few games. But he did set a record. I think it was his 4th game back against Patrick Ewing and the Knicks, where he scored 55 points in the Garden, which is a record against the Knicks on their home court. They made it to the playoffs. They won the first round against the Hornets, but they lost the Eastern Conference semifinals to the Orlando Magic. And this was a young Orlando Magic team with Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway. This was considered the team of the future. They dethroned the Bulls. Now keep in mind, other than 1990, Jordan hadn't lost a series in the 90s. You know, he didn't play the 94, obviously, but every time he played, they won. So this fueled Jordan in the offseason. Even though he had a movie, Space Jam, that came out, he worked extra hard. He did pickup games. He wanted to get his game back to an elite status. So in 96, in the offseason, they acquired Dennis Rodman. This formed one of the greatest defensive teams in NBA history, and they set a then record of 72-10 record. 72 wins, 10 losses. They were the number 1 defensive team. They were the number 1 offensive team. Ultimately, their record was beaten in 2016 with the Golden State Warriors that went 73-9. But this, at that point, was the greatest NBA record. Jordan won his MVP that year. He put up 30.4 points per game, 6.8 rebounds, 4.3 assists, 2.2 steals. And this is when his shooting efficiency started to drop. It wasn't horrible. He averaged 49% from the line, but this is because he started shooting more threes. He started working on his 3-point game. He averaged 42% from the 3-point line. Now, the Bulls beat the Heat in the first round. They beat the Knicks in the second round. But then they had a rematch with the Orlando Magic in the conference finals. And the Orlando Magic were a 62-win team that year. And they beat them 4-0. They obliterated them. A lot of the reason why they struggled the year prior was their interior rebounding. So Dennis Rodman fixed a lot of that. They just had to improve on the team. But going into the finals, they were matched up against the Seattle Supersonics. And this team, they'd be talked about if this Bulls team didn't exist. They themselves went 64-18. They themselves were a defensive juggernaut. They were one of the greatest defensive teams of all time. They were the second best defensive team in the NBA at that time. They were led by Gary Payton, who's the only point guard to ever win Defensive Player of the Year. They had Shawn Kemp. They had a very deep team. Hersey Hawkins, Nate McMillan, Irvin Johnson, Detlef Schrempf. It was a deep team. Sam Perkins. But going into the finals, however, the Bulls, they didn't even make it look fair. The Bulls took game 1, took game 2, and took game 3. So at this point, the Sonics were just in survive mode. And Shawn Kemp played the best basketball he could. He had a 25-point game performance in game 4, and they took game 4 and they took game 5. But the Bulls would end it in game 6, 87-75. Jordan, this is his worst finals. And I don't mean it's a bad finals, I just mean it's his worst performance. His shooting percentages were pretty low. And this is because, he's playing Gary Payton. And part of the stupidity of the Sonics team was they didn't have Gary Payton guard Jordan. until I think it was game 4. I don't know what they were thinking, but they won game 4 and 5 when Peyton was guarding Jordan. So that's a what if. I still think the Bulls would have won, but they would have made it much more competitive. Other than, they wouldn't have gotten blown out those first 3 games. But going into the 97 season, Jordan and the Bulls went 69-13. Now this is their first matchup in the finals with the Utah Jazz. This Jazz team had been together for about a decade at this point, Stockton and Malone. And they're kind of a team that they'd have a really good year, lose in the first round. Next year, come back, maybe they get to the conference finals. They just couldn't get it done. But the Utah Jazz defeated the Houston Rockets, which had a super team at the time, where they had Charles Barkley added to their team. It was off a Stockton game winner in Game 6. So they go to the finals. Game 1, the Bulls win 84-82. Game 2, the Bulls win 97-85. Game 3, the Utah Jazz win 104-93. Game 4, the Utah Jazz win 78-73. Now, the Game 5 is what's really interesting because although the story has changed now, the story goes Jordan was in Salt Lake City. He ordered a pizza and he got food poisoning. Now, there's lots of speculation on whether they did it on purpose, but the point is he had a fever in that Game 5. And they thought it was going to slow him down. He still put up 38 points with a fever. And if you look at the game, the footage, you can tell he's sick. He was throwing up before the game, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. And they won 90-88. Eventually, they took Game 6, 90-86, getting his 5th title. And I should mention, too, Jordan won the MVP that year in 97. Okay, now moving forward to the 98 Chicago Bulls season, you got to look at the Bulls organization. Jerry Krause was the executive. He felt he wasn't getting enough credit for this Bulls dynasty. Everyone was praising Jordan. Everyone was praising Pippen. And their coach, Phil Jackson, who was one of the greatest coaches of all time. But he didn't feel like he was getting any recognition. And with this Bulls team starting to get older, all of the rumors and everything was pointing that he was going to break this team up in the offseason. He said he wasn't going to bring back Phil Jackson. And Jordan said he wouldn't play for the team if Phil Jackson didn't come back. And there was multiple trade rumors the whole season about Scottie Pippen. So this became known as the last dance. This was their last shot. And this team dealt with a lot getting there. Pippen only played 44 games that year because of back injuries. Dennis Rodman was missing games because of his antics. But Jordan was carrying the load. He was 34 years old. His efficiency was the lowest of his career at that point. He averaged 46 points per game. He averaged 46 from the line, which was pretty low for Jordan standards. But he was carrying the offensive load of this team. He did win his finals MVP this year. He put up 28 points per game, 5.8 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 1.7 steals. Now, here's the thing. They go back to the finals. Well, I'll go back a little further. They go to the Eastern Conference Finals. They're matched up with the Indiana Pacers. This is the greatest Indiana Pacers team, in my opinion. Some people would say the 2000 team, but I think this was their most well-rounded team they had. And they pushed the Bulls to their limit. It went to 7 games. This was a good offensive and defensive team. And if you ever go on YouTube and watch that Game 7, in the intro, they said 1 game. This could be Jordan's final game because they didn't know if Jordan was going to retire. It was uncertain at this point. But that Game 7, the Bulls won 88-83. They go to the finals. They're matched up with the Utah Jazz again. Now this time it's different because the Jazz have the home court advantage. And this series is the most watched NBA series of all time. Most watched NBA finals. And for good reason. Game 1, the Jazz take it 88-85. Game 2, the Bulls win 93-88. Game 3, the Bulls, and this is the only blowout. The Bulls win 96-54. It's a horrible blowout, but this is the only game that wasn't close. The Bulls win in Game 4, 86-82. Game 5, the Jazz win 83-81. Now, going into Game 6, however, here's the thing. Pippen was having back problems that he'd been facing the whole year. And it was looking like the Jazz could win Game 6, bring it back to Game 7 on their home court, and win. And this, if you watch this game, Jordan was like he was possessed. He had 45 points out of the 87 points his team scored. And if you watch the game, it's just going back and forth the whole entire game. Very physical. It's a low-scoring game, obviously. Very physical, tough defensively. Now, what stands out, though, so going into the end of the game, fourth quarter, right? Like I said, it's been going back and forth the whole game. Jordan makes a couple of free throws. He puts the game at 83-84. But Stockton makes a three-pointer, putting the Jazz up 86-83. Chicago called the timeout. They put Kerr and Harper in the game. Now, Jordan ran up, made a layup, makes it 85-86. Now, this is one of the greatest moments in NBA history. Jazz are up. And there's a big turnover by Karl Malone. He wasn't watching his back. Jordan stole the ball from him. He runs up the court. There's about 37 seconds left, I believe. And he makes one of the most clutch shots in NBA history over the defender. Hits the game winner. And this is one of the most iconic pictures that you see of Jordan. Hits it 87-86. The Bulls win. And this is like something out of a story tale, you know? Hits the game winner, NBA Finals, rides off in the sunset with his 6th championship, his 2nd three-peat, and he's his 5th MVP. It's a perfect ending. However, he would retire in that offseason. The Bulls team would get broken up. Pippen would get traded to the Rockets. Kukoc stayed, but they just unloaded a lot of the roster. Krause wanted to prove he could build another championship caliber team, and he didn't do it. But anyways, Jordan retires, goes out on top. And I wish he stayed that way, because he comes back 3 years later in the 01-02 season with the Washington Wizards. And I like I said, I just wish he would have stayed on the Bulls and ended it there, because those Wizard teams, they weren't very good. He put up good games. He was 38 years old on that 01-02 season. He put up 22 points per game, but his efficiency was horrible. He shot 41% from the line. He was out of shape. Hadn't played in a while. The Washington Wizards didn't make the playoffs in the 01-02 or 02-03 season, but there are some iconic moments with him on the Wizard, like him against Kobe Bryant. But 02-03 was his final year. And so he ended his career. He's a 10-time scoring champion, 3-time steal champion, 6-time NBA champion, which he went 6-0 in the finals, 11-time All-NBA. He's the Rookie of the Year in 85, 9-time All-Defense. He's the 3-time All-Star Game MVP. He's the 88 Defensive Player of the Year. He's a 5-time regular season MVP and 6-time Finals MVP. And the consensus is, for most people, he's the greatest player of all time. Some people will say LeBron James. Some people will say Kareem. It's all in your opinion. But he's undoubtedly a top 3 player of all time. And what made him great was he elevated the league and made it a global game. The NBA, they struggled in the 70s with popularity. The 80s, they got more popular with Bird and Magic, obviously. But Jordan took it to new heights. And that 98 finals is the most watched NBA finals in history. And it shows because in the 98 season, his final year that he was there on the Bulls, he made $33 million that year on the Bulls. That's like what players make now. He made that in the late 90s. And obviously his shoe line is one of the most iconic shoe lines around the world. There are people that don't even know who Michael Jordan is as a player, but wear his shoes. So he cemented himself top 3 player in some people's mind, the GOAT in some people's mind, Michael Jordan.